Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving into a topic today that's especially important for safety and risk management, folks who work in unique environments.
Yeah.
We're talking about temporary labor camps,
Yeah.
TLCs.
Great.
And Safety One Source is actually sponsoring this deep dive.
Great.
So they're all about giving you the tools and the resources to stay ahead of the curve in safety. And, I think you'll find their support is really invaluable as we kind of unpack this whole topic.
Yeah, TLCs have some pretty specific challenges
Right.
that, a lot of safety professionals don't run into in more traditional settings. So we're going to be focusing on OSHA's Field Operations Manual, Chapter 12, to really understand how to approach inspections and risk assessments in these environments.
Okay, so, first things first, let's address the elephant in the room. Or should I say the elephant in the temporary room? When I first heard temporary labor camps, I pictured tents. Yurts,
Yeah.
very transient setups.
Right.
But then I dug into this manual, and let me tell you, my assumptions were totally challenged.
What surprised you?
Well, the manual clarifies that temporary, in this context, actually refers to the length of employment, not necessarily the physical structures themselves.
Interesting.
So we could be talking about workers who are housed in apartments for a 6-month construction project.
Okay.
Or folks who are living in more permanent structures,
Right.
but on a seasonal basis.
Yeah, so it's about the work.
Right. It's about the nature of the work, not just the look of the housing.
Exactly. And that's really important for how safety professionals think about risk assessment.
Okay.
You can't just assume that because a structure looks permanent, that it's not a TLC.
Definitely adds a layer of complexity.
Yeah.
And speaking of complexity, let's talk about this shared authority
Okay.
over TLCs.
Sure.
The manual mentions OSHA and the Wage and Hour Division having a say.
Yeah.
It's like having two referees for the same game. Who do you listen to?
Well, it's not quite a free-for-all. There's a pretty clear division of responsibility, at least in theory.
Okay.
So think of it this way. If the TLC is tied to an agricultural operation, like a farm or a processing plant, WHD takes the lead.
Okay.
But for everything else, construction, manufacturing, you name it, OSHA is generally in charge.
Okay, that makes sense. But then the manual throws this curveball even when OSHA is handling enforcement. WHD still gets to interpret the standards.
Oh.
Did I read that correctly?
You did.
Yeah.
And it can be confusing for safety professionals.
Yeah.
You're out there doing the inspection, but you have to follow another agency's interpretation of the rules.
So it's not enough to know the OSHA regulations backwards and forwards.
Right.
You also have to be in tune with WHD's take on things.
Yeah, and that's one of the ways that a resource like Safety One Source can really make a difference. They cut through all the regulatory jargon and give clear advice for safety professionals.
Definitely a valuable tool in any safety pro's arsenal.
Yeah.
Now, if we're talking about potential confusion, we have to touch on the variations we see at the state level.
Yeah.
The manual mentions state plans, states where things get even more nuanced.
Right. They highlight 8 states that primarily rely on WHD for TLC enforcement.
Okay.
Even outside of agriculture.
Yeah.
And then there are 14 other states with their own OSHA-proof plans. So they've got complete control over TLCs no matter what industry we're talking about.
So for those of you out there managing safety for companies with TLCs in multiple states, a one-size-fits-all approach just won't work.
It won't work.
You've got to tailor your safety program to the specific regulations of each state.
Absolutely. And that's a real challenge.
Yeah.
But luckily, Safety One Source offers resources to help you navigate this.
That's good.
They've got tools that make it easy to stay informed about state-specific regulations, so you can ensure compliance no matter where your TLCs are.
Okay, that's incredibly helpful. Now let's rewind the clock a bit and talk about this interesting tidbit in the manual about pre-1980 construction.
Oh, yeah.
It feels like we're stepping into a regulatory time warp.
That's a good way to put it.
Right.
When it comes to agricultural housing built before April 3rd, 1980, employers can actually choose whether to follow the older standards from the Employment and Training Administration or opt for the newer OSHA standards.
Wow. So they have options.
They do.
That seems surprisingly flexible for OSHA.
Well, it keeps things interesting for safety professionals.
Gosh.
Imagine walking into a TLC and needing to be familiar with both sets of standards and how violations would be cited under each.
Oh my gosh.
Talk about needing to be on your toes.
Yeah, it really highlights the importance of clear communication with employers.
Right.
Right. Everyone needs to be crystal clear about which standards are being applied.
Yeah, and why?
and why.
Yeah, and documenting those decisions is key.
Oh, for sure.
Clear documentation is your best friend when it comes to compliance.
Absolutely.
It protects you and the employer.
Good point.
Yeah.
Now, let's imagine we're a CSHO walking into a TLC for an inspection.
Okay.
What are those red flags, those key areas that would immediately grab our attention?
It all starts with the site itself.
Okay.
Are there areas that are prone to flooding?
Okay.
How close is the housing to livestock or potential sources of contamination?
Okay.
And is the site clean and sanitary? You can tell a lot about how much they care about safety just by observing those initial things.
Right. So first impressions really matter.
They do.
Then as we move inside the shelter, the focus kind of shifts, right?
Right, exactly. Now we're looking at protection from the elements.
Okay.
Is the shelter weather tight? Is there good ventilation?
Okay.
Then we look at the sleeping arrangements. Are they providing enough space per person? Is there proper screening on windows and doors? Are heating and cooking appliances installed correctly?
It sounds like a lot of detail to keep track of.
Yeah, it is.
Is there a way to simplify this for our listeners?
When it comes to inspecting a TLC, I always remember the 3 Ps.
Okay.
Protection from the elements.
Okay.
Privacy for the workers.
Okay.
And provisions for basic sanitation and hygiene.
The 3 Ps. I love it. That's definitely going to stick with me and hopefully with our listeners as well.
Good.
Now let's dive a little deeper into those provisions you mentioned.
Sure. So we're talking about water.
Okay.
Toilets and sewage.
Right.
Are these systems adequate?
Okay.
Were they sanitary?
Yep.
And are they compliant with all the codes?
Yeah.
These are non-negotiables when it comes to worker health.
It's easy to take those things for granted, but when you're living in a TLC, they become absolutely critical.
They do.
And beyond those basics, we're also evaluating laundry facilities, hand washing stations, bathing areas.
Right.
Preventing the spread of illness, especially in a communal living environment, depends on having those facilities in good working order. And I appreciate that the manual also calls out the need for proper lighting.
Yeah.
It's not just about safety. It's also about creating a space that's comfortable for the workers.
Absolutely.
Right.
Is there enough light to move around safely? Are the fixtures grounded and covered to prevent electrical hazards?
Yeah.
Are there enough outlets?
Yeah, these are all factors we need to consider.
Right.
It's about seeing the whole picture.
Yeah.
And understanding how all these elements come together.
Right.
The manual even touches on things like refuse disposal and pest control.
Right.
Making sure the TLC doesn't become a breeding ground for unwanted guests.
You got it.
And speaking of unwanted guests, let's not forget about first aid.
Oh, yeah.
Having adequate first aid readily available is so important in case of emergencies.
Absolutely.
You never know when an accident might happen. So being prepared is key.
Right.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dives, I want to bring up something that really made me pause. The fact that not all housing falls under OSHA's jurisdiction. There's this whole concept of housing being a term and condition of employment.
Right.
And I have to admit, I'm not totally clear on what that means in practice.
Yeah, it's a crucial point.
Okay.
And it can be tricky.
Yeah.
So OSHA's oversight only kicks in if the housing is considered an integral part of the employment arrangement.
Okay.
If an employer offers optional housing that workers can take or leave,
All right.
OSHA might not have the same authority.
Okay.
But if that housing is required,
right.
or if it's in an isolated area with no other options, or if it's heavily subsidized by the employer, then it's more likely to be considered a term and condition of employment and subject to OSHA's standards.
So there's a bit of a gray area.
There is.
Where it's not always a clear-cut yes or no.
Right. The manual highlights several factors to consider, like whether the housing is free or heavily discounted, who owns it and who controls it, the distance to alternative housing, even the employer's motive for providing the housing in the first place.
It sounds like this is an area where safety professionals would really benefit from working with their legal teams.
Definitely.
To make sure they're on solid ground.
I agree.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive into temporary labor camps.
Yeah, we have.
We've explored the definition of temporary, the complexities of shared authority, and the importance of understanding those state-specific variations.
For sure.
And we've started to peel back the layers of what a TLC inspection looks like, focusing on those initial red flags and those crucial 3 Ps.
The 3 Ps.
That should guide any assessment.
Yeah.
Remember, this deep dive is brought to you by Safety One Source.
That's right.
They're dedicated to providing you with the resources you need to navigate these complex issues.
Yeah.
and ensure worker safety in all settings.
They're a fantastic resource.
Be sure to check out their website for more information.
They offer a ton of knowledge and tools.
That can be incredibly valuable, especially when it comes to deciphering the nuances of TLC regulations and best practices.
Absolutely. So welcome back to our deep dive into temporary labor camps. Before the break, we were talking about those initial red flags you might encounter during an inspection.
Right.
But I think it's important to remember that inspections are just one piece of the puzzle when it comes to worker safety.
For sure.
In TLCs.
You're absolutely right. It's about more than just ticking boxes on a checklist. We need to think about the bigger picture, about creating a culture of safety that extends beyond the physical inspection.
Exactly. That's where a good risk assessment comes in.
Okay.
Before you even set foot in a TLC, you need to be thinking about the potential hazards that are specific to that work environment and that workforce.
Okay, so walk me through that.
Yeah.
What are some of the key things that safety pros should be considering when they're conducting a risk assessment for a TLC?
Well, first and foremost, you need to understand the nature of the work being done. What are the tasks involved? What tools and equipment are they using? Are there any inherent risks associated with the industry or the specific job site?
So if we're talking about agricultural work, we'd be thinking about things like exposure to pesticides, heat stress, the potential for machinery-related accidents.
Exactly. And if it's a construction site, our focus might shift to things like fall hazards, electrical safety, the safe handling of heavy materials.
It's all about tailoring the assessment to the unique circumstances of each TLC. It's not one size fits all.
Precisely. And beyond the work itself, we also need to consider the workers.
Okay.
What are their demographics? Do they have any pre-existing health conditions that might make them more vulnerable to certain hazards?
Okay.
Are there any language barriers or cultural factors that might impact their understanding of safety procedures?
It's about recognizing that worker safety is not just about physical hazards, but also about taking into account those individual and social factors that can play a role. It's a much more holistic approach.
And this is where that human element we talked about before really comes into focus.
Okay.
Remember, these workers are often in vulnerable positions far from home and potentially facing unique stressors related to their living and working conditions.
So how can safety professionals go beyond just the technical aspects of the job and really advocate for the well-being of these workers?
It starts with communication.
Okay.
Take the time to talk to the workers, learn about their concerns, and really listen to what they have to say. They're the ones on the front lines. And they often have really valuable insights into the potential hazards that might be overlooked during a traditional inspection.
It's about building trust and creating an environment where workers feel comfortable speaking up about safety concerns.
And beyond just listening, we need to empower workers to actually participate in the safety process.
Okay, how do we do that?
That means providing clear and accessible training, making sure that safety procedures are translated into their native languages, and encouraging them to report any hazards they encounter.
It's about making safety a shared responsibility rather than something imposed from the top down.
Exactly. And I think it's also important for safety professionals to remember that they have a duty to protect workers. Even if it means pushing back against employers who might be prioritizing profits over people.
That could be a tough position to be in, especially if you're dealing with an employer who isn't particularly receptive to safety concerns.
It can be, but at the end of the day, worker safety has to be the top priority. And if that means having difficult conversations, raising concerns, or even escalating issues to higher authorities, then that's what we need to do.
It's about having the courage to stand up for what's right. Even when it's not easy.
And speaking of resources and support, I want to circle back to our sponsor, Safety One Source. They're not just about providing information and tools. They also offer training and consulting services to help safety professionals develop the skills and confidence they need to be effective advocates for worker safety. That's fantastic. It sounds like they really understand the challenges that safety professionals face in these unique settings and are committed to providing comprehensive support.
And their website is a treasure trove of information. White papers, webinars, case studies, you name it.
Wow.
If you're dealing with TLCs, I highly recommend checking out their resources.
Agreed. Now, earlier we touched on that tricky situation.
Right.
Where an employer gets to choose between older and newer standards.
Yeah.
For pre-1980 agricultural housing.
Right.
Seems like that could create a lot of gray areas.
It does.
For safety pros.
Especially when it comes to enforcement.
Right.
Imagine you're conducting an inspection.
Yeah.
And the employer insists they're in compliance.
But they're referencing standards from like a bygone era.
Oh my God, talk about a headache.
Yeah.
How do you even begin to navigate that?
Documentation.
Okay.
That's your best defense in those situations.
Okay.
When you're doing that initial assessment, document everything.
Okay.
The age of the structures, the standards that you're applying.
Okay.
Any conversations you have with the employer about their choices. That way, if there's ever a dispute, you've got a clear paper trail to support your actions.
So it's not just about being knowledgeable.
Right.
It's also about being meticulous.
Yeah.
And creating a record of your due diligence.
For sure.
That's a crucial takeaway for our listeners.
This whole discussion about pre-1980 construction highlights a larger point.
Okay.
About TLCs and workplace safety in general.
Okay.
We can't just rely on regulations and standards to create a safe environment. We need to be thinking critically, applying our knowledge and our experience, and advocating for continuous improvement.
You're right. It's about seeing beyond the letter of the law and understanding the spirit of what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
Protecting workers.
Right.
And ensuring that they can go home safely at the end of the day.
That's the heart of it all.
Exactly.
And while we're on that topic, I want to bring up something that often gets overlooked in discussions about TLCs.
What's that?
The mental health of these workers.
Oh, wow. Okay.
We tend to focus on physical hazards.
Right.
But the psychological impact of living and working in these settings can't be ignored.
It's such an important point.
Yeah.
Think about it. These workers are often far from home, living in close quarters with strangers, potentially facing language barriers or cultural differences. That can be incredibly isolating and stressful.
Exactly. And that stress can manifest in a lot of ways. Increased anxiety, depression, difficulty sleeping, even substance abuse.
So how can safety professionals be more attuned to the mental health needs of TLC workers? What are some practical steps they can take?
Well, first and foremost, it's about creating a culture of openness and support.
Okay.
Let workers know that it's okay to talk about their mental health.
Yeah.
And that resources are available if they need help.
That sounds similar to what we talked about with fostering open communication.
Right.
Around physical safety concerns.
It is.
It's about building that trust and making workers feel comfortable speaking up.
Exactly. And beyond that, we need to be aware of the potential signs of mental distress.
Okay, like what?
Changes in behavior withdrawal, increased irritability, difficulty concentrating. If you notice those signs, don't hesitate to reach out to the worker and offer support.
You know, this whole discussion about mental health really underscores the point you made earlier about safety professionals needing to be advocates for workers.
Yeah.
It's not just about preventing accidents.
Right.
It's about supporting the whole person.
I couldn't agree more. And that brings us to another important aspect of TLC safety. That, I think, deserves more attention. Fire safety.
Okay.
We often focus on workplace hazards.
Yeah.
But fire is a very real risk in any residential setting.
Right.
And TLCs are no exception.
Oh, absolutely. Especially when you consider that many TLCs might be located in rural areas. With limited access to fire services.
That's a key consideration. So when you're inspecting a TLC, pay close attention to things like the presence of working smoke detectors, fire extinguishers, clear evacuation routes.
Are there any specific OSHA standards that address fire safety in TLCs?
While there isn't a specific standard dedicated solely to fire safety in TLCs, several OSHA standards apply to general industry and construction. That can be relevant.
Okay, can you give us some examples?
Sure. For instance, OSHA's Standard 1910.38, Employee Emergency Plans and Fire Prevention Plans, requires employers to have plans in place for dealing with fire emergencies. This includes having procedures for reporting fires, evacuating employees, and using fire suppression equipment.
And that would apply to any workplace, including TLC.
That's correct. And then you have standards like 1910.157, which covers portable fire extinguishers, and 1910.39, which deals with fire brigades. These standards provide detailed guidance on the selection, placement, and maintenance of fire safety equipment, as well as the training requirements for employees who might be involved in fighting fires.
So while there might not be a dedicated TLC fire safety standard, there's still plenty of relevant guidance
right.
within OSHA's existing regulations.
Exactly. And don't forget about the National Fire Protection Association, or NFPA.
Okay.
They have a wealth of resources and codes that can help inform your fire safety assessments and recommendations.
It sounds like fire safety in TLCs requires a multifaceted approach.
Yeah.
Drawing on various regulations and best practices.
That's right. It's about taking a proactive and comprehensive approach.
Right.
To make sure that TLCs are equipped to handle fire emergencies, and that workers are prepared to respond safely. And this brings us back to our main theme, the importance of safety professionals being informed and engaged.
I'm curious, what's the most common mistake you see employers making when it comes to TLC safety, especially in relation to fire safety?
One of the most frequent oversights I see is the lack of proper training for workers. Employers might have fire extinguishers on site, but if the workers don't know how to use them, they're useless.
And that's where that communication piece we talked about earlier comes into play again, right?
Exactly.
Making sure that training is accessible, understandable, and relevant to the specific risks present in that TLC.
And it's not just about initial training. It's about providing regular refreshers and making sure workers know what to do in an emergency.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground when it comes to fire safety in TLCs.
Yeah.
But what about other potential hazards that might be specific to these settings?
Yeah.
Are there any that stand out in your experience?
One that often comes to mind is the risk of carbon monoxide poisoning.
Okay.
Especially in TLCs that rely on gas-powered appliances for heating or cooking.
That's a scary thought. Yeah. Carbon monoxide is odorless and colorless.
Right.
So it can be difficult to detect without proper equipment.
Exactly, and it can be fatal.
Yeah.
That's why it's crucial to make sure that all gas-powered appliances are properly vented.
Okay.
And that carbon monoxide detectors are installed and maintained in all sleeping areas.
It sounds like another one of those essential provisions we talked about earlier.
It is.
Basic, but absolutely vital for worker safety and well-being.
You got it. And while we're talking about potential hazards, we can't forget about sanitation and hygiene.
Right.
Communal living spaces like TLCs can be breeding grounds for germs and illnesses if proper precautions aren't taken.
It's almost like you're trying to prevent a mini epidemic.
Right.
Within the TLC.
Right.
What are some of the key things that safety professionals should be looking for when they're assessing sanitation and hygiene?
Start with the basics.
Okay.
Are there enough toilets and hand washing facilities for the number of workers?
Okay.
Are they clean and well maintained? Is there an adequate supply of hot water?
And what about things like food storage and preparation?
Yeah.
Are there proper refrigeration facilities? Are workers being educated about safe food handling practices?
Those are all critical considerations.
Right.
Remember, we're not just talking about comfort here. We're talking about preventing the spread of potentially serious illnesses.
So it's about creating a culture of cleanliness and hygiene within the TLC, just like we talked about creating a culture of safety overall.
Precisely. And it's important to involve the workers in this process.
Okay.
Encourage them to report any sanitation or hygiene concerns.
Okay.
And empower them to take ownership of maintaining a clean and healthy living environment.
It's a team effort for sure.
Yeah.
Now, before we move on, I want to touch on something we briefly mentioned earlier.
Yay.
The role of legal counsel.
Yeah.
In navigating the complexities of TLC regulations.
Yeah.
Why is it so important for safety professionals to have a good relationship with their legal team?
Well, as we've seen, TLC regulations can be incredibly nuanced.
Right.
And they often vary from state to state.
Right.
Having a legal expert on your side can help you interpret those regulations correctly. Make sure you're applying the right standards and navigate any potential disputes or legal challenges.
It's almost like having a translator for the legal jargon.
Yeah.
Someone who can help you understand the implications of the regulations in practical terms.
Exactly. And they can also be a valuable resource when it comes to developing policies and procedures, drafting contracts with employers, and making sure that your safety program is legally sound.
So it's not just about knowing the rules.
Right.
It's about understanding how to apply them in a way that protects both the workers and the company.
Absolutely. And don't forget, your legal team can also provide guidance on how to handle those tricky situations where you might need to push back against an employer who isn't prioritizing safety. They can help you navigate those conversations and make sure you're doing everything you can to protect the workers.
It sounds like a strong partnership between safety professionals and legal counsel is essential for navigating the complexities of TLC safety.
It really is. And this brings us back to a point we touched on earlier.
Right.
The ethical dimension of this work.
Right.
We've talked about regulations, standards, best practices.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's about doing what's right for the workers.
It's about recognizing that these are human beings.
Right.
Often in vulnerable positions.
Yeah.
And that our actions can have a real impact on their lives.
And it's about having the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult or unpopular.
You know, we've covered so much ground in this deep dive.
We have.
But I feel like we've barely scratched the surface.
I agree.
There's so much to learn and consider.
There is.
When it comes to ensuring the safety and well-being of workers in TLCs.
It's a constantly evolving landscape, and that's why it's so important for safety professionals to stay informed, engaged, and committed to continuous learning.
And remember, you don't have to navigate this complex world alone. Safety. One Source is here to help with a wealth of resources and support to empower you to be the best safety advocate you can be.
Absolutely.
Be sure to check out their website for more information.
They're a fantastic resource, and I highly recommend taking advantage of what they have to offer.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody. We've been talking about temporary labor camps, a topic that's full of, nuances and honestly some real head scratchers for safety professionals. But before we wrap up, I want to make sure we leave our listeners with some actionable takeaways.
Yeah, I agree. We've covered a lot, from the very definition of temporary to those specific hazards you might see during an inspection. But how can safety professionals really, translate all this information into positive change on the ground?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
So for those of you out there who are responsible for TLC safety, what's the one piece of advice you would give them? What's that key thing they should always keep in mind?
I think it comes down to this. TLC workers are often in vulnerable positions, far from home, and potentially facing unique challenges that we might not see in more traditional work settings.
Yeah.
Our role as safety professionals is to be their advocates, their champions.
It's about going beyond just enforcing regulations and really seeing those workers as individuals, understanding their needs, ensuring your voices are heard.
Exactly. It's about building trust, fostering open communication, and creating a culture where safety is everyone's responsibility. And sometimes it means having the courage to push back against those who might prioritize profits over people.
We've talked a lot about the technical aspects of TLC safety, the regulations, the hazards, the inspections. But you're reminding us that there's a deeper human element at play here.
Yeah.
And that's something we can't afford to lose sight of.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, it's about ensuring that every worker, regardless of their living or working situation, has the right to a safe and healthy environment.
And that's a mission worth fighting for.
Okay.
Now, before we sign off, I want to remind everybody that this deep dive was brought to you by Safety One Source, a company that's dedicated to empowering safety professionals with the knowledge, the tools, and the resources they need to make a real difference in the lives of workers.
They've been a great partner in this deep dive, and their website is a treasure trove of information on TLCs and countless other workplace safety topics. I highly encourage our listeners to check it out.
It's a fantastic resource, and we're so grateful for their support. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. We've covered a ton of ground, but I hope you found this deep dive into temporary labor camps informative and, most importantly, inspiring.
It's been great talking about this with you.
Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and as always, stay safe.